So good morning, everybody. Welcome to another of the Teaching Academy PD series for session 2026-30. This morning's session is being run by Pirwoon Anela Seric, sorry about pronunciation if I'm getting it wrong, people, and Ana Torres Ahumada, and it is on designing AI inclusive assessments, looking at the Care Plus framework. Some of you may remember the session that the presenters ran during edX last year in CS edX, where they introduced the framework, and today is a continuation from what was initially presented there. So I'm guessing there may be part refresher, part updated information, I'm not sure. But without further ado, I am going to hand over to Arnella and Pierre to kick off today's session.
Thank you very much. Well, I guess that starts today's presentation really well. So we will present and talk about how to design AI inclusive assessments. Sometimes last year, Pierre, Anna, and I realized that we have similar ideas in terms of introducing AI. And we started chatting about it and realized that our approaches have some similarities. And talking more about it, we've developed what we're presenting today, Care Plus framework. So we will talk a bit more about Care Plus principles, 6 steps of AI inclusive assessment design. And then we really wanted to talk more today about how each of us have applied the same framework in different ways. We also have some implementation resources that we're happy to share. And then we'll have a little chat, and we are happy to answer all of your questions. We can tell you a lot more than what we prepared to talk about today. So let's get into it. So this was our starting point. I think that the image on this slide represents how maybe most of us understand they are using AI. What does it actually mean? It can mean so many different things. When I was preparing a subject outline for MGT 510, this idea was presented to me by my colleagues as a defeat for lecturers. And I wanted to represent so many dilemmas that come out of that one sentence. So on one hand, yes, it can be such a positive experience. We can do something wonderful with AI. It can assist our students to be more efficient, to generate new ideas. It can help students to deal with their language barriers if English is not their first language, or disabilities. And ultimately, we hear that employers want students that have AI skills. And then on the other hand, we're thinking, well, are they misusing AI? Are they just adding the task into the AI tool and getting the answer and copy pasting it into the Word document, and that's the end of the story? There's no learning happening. That is probably the main worry that we have as lecturers. So based on all of these different thoughts, we thought it's actually important to have a framework, to have a starting point that we need to consider that will guide us through this process and maybe help us rethink our assumptions about AI use in assessments. Pierre, over to you.
Thanks, Anila. Do you want to go to the next slide? Thanks, Anila. Yeah, Anila give you some context, brief one to show you how we actually come sit down and come up with these principles. I also like to add a point which have impact how I design my subjects last year and this year, which is at the time when we sat down, the university pretty much still have the restricted use of AI at that time. And then, as we all know, the paradigm kind of shift to encourage use of AI in the summer last year. So that actually has affected how I would have designed my subjects. But here you go. These are the 5 principles that we thought will be good to have in any, especially the first time use of designing, including AI in the assessment framework. And we sat down a few times, 3 of us, to review these since our last presentation last year, and we thought these are still pretty much valid and stays. So the first one talks about contextual authenticity for subjects, which very much linked to the transferability in the last one, where we want to show and make sure that we include real world scenario for the assessment in our assessment design. This will make sure that our assessments are meaningful in our unique discipline, and it's hopefully make it really hard to outsource to AI without genuine understanding of the subject content in our own discipline. And the next we want to uphold is the policy on academic integrity. We need to safeguard to ensure the originality or fairness of our assessments. These include, we like to include, talk about guidelines on how students can or cannot use AI in our assessment design, give students examples, and also how to prevent misuse. For example, we require students to declare how they use AI in their work, in our design. So we want to include that principle in our assessments. On the reflection and empowerment, we try to shift the agency and responsibility or ownership of learning from the teacher or lecturer to the students. We want them to think about and be consciously aware of their thinking process when they interact with AI. So the metacognition happening there. And we can also sometimes include an activity that intentionally asks students to actually write down or put in a written form of their reflection activities in the form of submission of a reflection summary, but that could be implicit as well. We also promote ethical use of AI tools. We want them to be transparent of how they use it. So again, we might have questions to ask students to answer in whatever form, that how they have used it, what tool that they use, and how did they verify output from AI. So all these principles will support the principles of our framework that will be easily transferable in any discipline, in all the different industries and different technical areas, and also types of assessments. Would you like to go next slide, Anela? Next one. So we now would like to talk about the different stages that we again put down in order to consider all the principles that we discussed. We sort of modify this a little bit, but they still stay. And I'd like to say that some of these activities, when we think through the whole entire assessment design, might be explicit, that students are asked to perform some tasks specifically to go through or to achieve one or more of these stages, but some of them could be implicit in the output that they produce. So the thing to start with is the entire assessment design. We now have to think about whether or not the AI, by including the AI, how that is going to affect the entire design of our subject. So not just one single assessment item, But however, this can still be applicable in one assessment item or the entire subject's assessment design. So I think what we're trying to say here is that we need to sit down and ask ourselves, what is the purpose of us including the AI? For example, what is being assessed? Are we assessing the AI knowledge or AI skills, or giving students an opportunity to actually explore the use of AI in their own context? And we also want to deliberately link outcomes, our subject learning outcomes, into the assessment design. So in other words, you can see it's a scaffolding of the entire assessment structure of our subject, not just adding AI in any parts of the design when we write it. So the most important thing is we prepare our students. So 3 of us prepare our students in quite different ways. We want to make sure that they are comfortable in using that, and they are aware of the different resources internally offered by CSU, but also externally, and they are exposed to that knowledge. And in terms of evaluation of outputs, we encourage deliberately, sometimes again, ask them to perform certain tasks that they need to evaluate or verify or testify the outputs produced by AI. In different manners that we apply that stage. Application and decision making refers to students being aware and deliberately make decision whether to adopt, verify, change, or just ignore, abandon AI's output. So from that process, they realize what AI can or cannot do, and finally, produce work that are solely their own, that represent their own judgment and their thoughts. And as part of all this, they would reflect the whole learning process by interacting with AI. And again, we can ask for a deliberate task to be performed by getting students to write a reflection summary, for example. So the whole entire process of this, we encourage authenticity of not just the subject matter, but also the output of the students. Again, that linked to the shift of the responsibility or learning agency that we talked about earlier from lecturer to the student. Thanks, Sunila. So next, we like to start with continue with sharing how 3 of us we apply these framework and principles in our subjects. So I'd like to start with one subject that I applied in last year. I started incorporating AI with little small changes. Perhaps start with by just adding AI straightforward, like directly, without thinking the whole picture and sit down and think about the whole scaffolding initially to start with. But eventually last year, this is how it landed. So I mandate the use of AI in one of the assessment items. At that time, the student would have 3 assessments and plus exams. In this particular second year accounting subjects, the students the main task is, main learning outcome is to understand, interpret, and apply the principles that they learn from the accounting standards. So this particular assessment assess students on one of the specific accounting standards by requiring them to prepare a couple of financial statements, so to say. There are 3 questions. First question require them to apply their knowledge from another 2 accounting standards that require them to solve accounting problem, which is only about 1 to 200 words. And then question 2 is to prepare the, I wouldn't say full set, but the balance sheet and P&L of the scenario given. That is where they would get AI to prepare the reports. And question 3, get them to deliberately write down their reflection summary how they use AI, what helps them in that entire process when they use or use AI as their partner in completing question 2. It is mandatory use for question 2 only, not allowed for question 1 and 3. And how do we make sure that? Well, we can only put the onus on them by getting them to complete the assessment, including a declaration statement that they have only used it for that particular question. I have also put a prerequisite quiz in the subject where they can only see the submission portal if they completed a quiz. And the purpose of the quiz is to prepare, to disseminate or give them all the different resources that they can find, both mainly internally by CSU from the library, DLT, and so on, and all the resources they can find about the AI, the use of AI, and particularly point to the part where what are the different tools, with the assumption that at least half or majority of them would actually use AI for the initially or in their initial stage. That is the feedback that I've got since 2024. So the purpose of the quiz is mainly to disseminate information and give them the time to go through those information. Again, the onus is on them, whether they actually read that and gain that knowledge. And then they would proceed to complete question 2, limit to 5 prompts. Why I put a limit of 5 prompts, it was from 2024 that I realized sometimes students just put in not very effective prompts. So after I have pointed to them where to look at how to write effective prompt, so I wanted students to consciously knowing that they have just 5 prompts to put in, and they would only submit the interaction between them and AI limited to the 5 prompts that they would submit as part of their assessments. And then they would proceed to finish a 500 words reflection summary. Now, how is this applied to the assessment design or the stage or the principles that we have talked about? In terms of assessment design, I have put in the actual real world scenario of preparing financial statements, and then 3 of the 4 learning outcomes were achieved. And in that particular assessment, the key motivation of me including AI was to allow students the exposure, because I mandate the use of AI. At that time, the use of AI was pretty much restricted according to the university's policy, but I mandated to allow them the opportunity to actually gain or obtain some literacy skill and to improve their digital literacy, because with the expectation that the employers would expect them to be able to use AI by the time they graduate. So that was pretty much the motive of including AI in that at that time. And then I prepare students by, mandating again the resources that they have to go through in the pre-req quiz, and they were asked as a deliberate task to evaluate the AI output. In the reflection summary, they will have to explain how did they decide whether they adopt, adapt, or abandon AI's work by checking AI's output against the accounting standards or any other authority documents in the accounting discipline. And then they reflect on their work by submitting question 3 reflection summary. I also require screenshots of their interaction with AI together with the declaration statement that we mentioned in order to uphold the authenticity of their work. So that's how I apply the second year accounting subject in the last year session. Thanks, Anela. So this year I move on to, which is a continuous, the next subject when they progress into their 3rd year, just this current session, where I incorporate the status or the stand of the AI use at the university, where the AI is encouraged instead of restricted. So still aim at improving or allow students to gain AI literacy, still designing a real world situation in a different set of technical content about business combination and consolidation. However, in my entire design, I also incorporate the supervised assessments idea or policy that we talk so much about now, and fulfilling 3 out of the 4 subject learning outcomes for the 2 assessments. So the subject has both 2 assessment, 1 and 2, plus exam. Assessment 2 is incorporating the supervised assessment component, which I put in the interactive oral assessment, including the use of AI. However, I have shifted from mandatory use to optional use, aligned with the idea where the use of AI as the university stands now will be encouraging rather than restricted. So, and also with the expectation that the student now would be much more comfortable with the use of AI, whether in their personal life or in their learning and teaching purposes. So I still hear voices from students where they, some of them really resist, right, not to use AI. From their experience in the second year subject, some of them would say, AI is rubbish. They don't give any good output, and by using AI, it only confuses them. So therefore, I have shifted from mandatory use to optional use. And the students would need to complete a pre-assessment survey. So instead of the purpose of that survey or quiz, whatever you call it, instead of disseminating resources, I shifted into, again, emphasize even more on student taking agency in their own learning. So in that survey, they actually have to complete questions about what tool do they use? Do they actually use any tool in the first place? And if they do, which tool do they use? And how did they use it? Although I did put some guidelines in the assessment design and suggestion examples of how they can use AI in completing that particular assessment. And I also asked them to explain by giving examples how they have actually verified AI's output in that process. So that particular survey would again conform with the authenticity of an agency, and which is also improved or enhanced by using the supervised assessment component in that particular area. So in terms of preparing students in this particular subject, instead of getting them to go through a list of resources, I prepare them by, from the first day interaction with them in online meetings. I show them where to get information on AI, and also promote, or rather encourage them to use Copilot, because under the enterprise license, and talked about the potential issues that AI might present if it is not institutionalized license. And the evaluation of AI output is kind of captured in that particular survey. However, I realize the application and decision making and reflection and learning are implicit process rather than an explicit task required of students, in the sense that because the AI use is now optional and some of them may not use AI, they decided not to use it. And for those who use it as part of their completion of tasks, it is expected that they go through that process, reflecting on AI's output, with the confirmation that they complete that question, that they had to illustrate with examples how they actually use or verify AI's output. That for those students who decided to use AI, they are asked, instead of screenshots, because I realized that could be quite lengthy at times, without any limit of prompt in this particular subject, the students are asked to record a short video by showing their interaction with AI which is part of their submission requirement. So that's my part in how I apply AI in my 2 subjects since from last year compared to this year. So thank you, and I'll take questions later on.
Good morning, everyone. I want to share a story with you. I want to share with you how my students and I embark on a journey together and how that journey led us to acknowledge, to recognize the importance of thoughtfully and carefully incorporating AI into assessment, designs, and learning. So my students really remind me of my children. They quickly sense when something is not working, and they often assume that it is someone else's job to fix it, usually my responsibility. So that's exactly what happened at the Wagga campus. What happened was that a group of students came to me and they said to me, ChatGPT works in all of our subjects, miss, but is not working in the legal subjects. These students, they were quite genuine about it. They didn't understand why AI couldn't solve their legal problems. That was the issue. And they were getting good marks, good grades using AI in other subjects. So what they were doing was quite interesting because they were blaming the subject and even myself because we were obsolete and we needed to keep up with trend and with technology. So they were implying that the subject needed to change to accommodate the use of this emerging technology. And guess what? They were right. So instead of reacting defensively or rushing to conclusions or panicking, again, like in parenting, I pause and I use my academic wisdom, not from knowledge, but just because I am old and I have been teaching for a long time. So I didn't want to dismiss what my students were saying, and I didn't want to assume that they were unethically or that they were misusing AI in their papers. What I wanted to do is that I wanted to listen attentively, and I actually was curious of what they had to say because I wasn't well acquainted with AI either. So I invited the class to an informal conversation, and the conversation was actually quite lively, and it was quite refreshing, and it was quite revealing. Some students blame the university because it wasn't supporting and encouraging the use of AI. Other students blame the ILAC methodology of legal problem solving, which is the methodology that we use in law to solve problem-based questions. They said, well, this needs some flexibility. It needs to accommodate the use of AI. Other students suggested that the assessments should be redesigned so they could be answered more easily using AI. Other students says, we don't want to be lawyers, so we don't understand why are you so obsessed, miss, with legal problem solving. So they did. They questioned legal problem solving. I lacked my methodology, and they didn't know why these themes dominated so much of our assessments. But something was clear to me from the outset. Legal problem solving was not negotiable. Why? Well, this skill is consistently, repeatedly identified, and we all know this, in workplace learning, research, and spaces as one of the areas where our graduates struggle the most. So I am like, okay, Anna, stop and think. So I put on my thinking hat and I drew on a key principle of negotiation, which is one of the courses that I teach, Law 519. And I said to myself, you need to separate the people from the problem here. So the problem wasn't my students, it wasn't AI, and hopefully it wasn't me. The issue here was how to approach learning in a way that developed proper problem-solving skills and legal reasoning while also engaging with emerging technology, which is AI. I also knew that there were many myths about AI. That's not unusual. We fear things that we don't understand. But my intention, I didn't want to jump into conclusions. I didn't want to correct the assumptions that my students have immediately. So I wanted to create like a safe space in which they could test through responsible and well-structured learning and engagement, the use of AI, its validities, its deficiencies, its positive aspects, etc. So in these conversations, I also asked my students, what were the main concerns? Why is it that AI couldn't solve legal problems? Well, they said, and they were quite honest, well, we don't have a lot of time sometimes to listen to the recording of your lectures or to read through your materials. So we tend to disregard task instructions or your guidance. So we rely too much on AI. And that was the shock, that we can do that with our subjects, but with yours and your ILAC methodology means this is a little bit different. So other students say, well, our answers seem to be vague or too generic, or sometimes when we are trying to answer a legal problem using AI, the answer is just, it's like a legal essay, but that legal essay ignored the structure methodology of ILAC. One of my favorites were some students, they said, Miss, we felt fabulous because English is not our first language, and our statements and our sentences sounded so good that we were just ready to copy and paste, but there were a bunch of fluff. They lack a lot of legal substance. So I really like that they were able to articulate that. Other students says, Miss, the legislation was irrelevant to the jurisdiction. The cases were some cases were citing the Privy Council, and we don't even follow in Australia the decisions of the Privy Council. Other students says that they didn't know, they were prevented from using legal databases such as LexisNexis or Westlaw or even OSLI, because going to AI was easier. Something that I found very interesting of these conversations is that some students says that they felt guilty or that they feel unease about using AI when they knew that their lecturers appeared to discourage. So they were having like a cognitive dissonance. It's like they were almost compelled to do it. They couldn't help it, but they felt that it was wrong. Another interesting revealing aspect of this conversation with my students was related to the Dunning-Kruger effect. Some students, which have limited or didn't have a lot of legal knowledge, they were able to polish AI outputs for correctness. So they were feeling that they were amazing. They saw they were like jurisprudence, but without the skill to evaluate the information producing by AI, confidence increases, but their understanding of those concepts didn't. So this conversation quickly make it very clear for me that we have a challenge, and the solution was the CARE model. So the solution was to design an assessment, and my ingredients, my requirements for that assessment was that I wanted it to be aligned with our principles of assessments. So I wanted it to be valid, authentic. I wanted it to be aligned with the subject learning outcome, with the resources that we have produced, properly scaffolded, and also that help students to achieve the learning outcomes that we want of our graduates. I also didn't want it to be boring. I wanted like something really challenging and engaging and that sparked their interest. And I was also concerned with transferability of skills such as independent and reflective thinking. Something interesting was that I didn't want them to reproduce my views on artificial intelligence, and this mirror how we approach the inclusion of indigenous content in the curriculum, because I didn't want to present a single narrative. This is how Anna sees the world. No, I wanted to invite them to look at multiple voices, multiple opinions, perspectives, to sit with all this complexity and then develop their own judgment or their own informed position. So I guess that's it. That was the goal, to help my students to create independent professional judgment. And I also wanted it to be both safe and responsible. That was like talking to teenagers about sex. I knew that they were going to be doing it. So if they're going to do it, you need to understand the limits, the risk, and the ethical implications. So I'm like, okay, how am I going to secure that? Well, I spoke with Pierre, and she suggested, well, you should ask them to complete a non-assessable quiz before assessing the actual assessment, and that was really good. I also gave them other university-endorsed and university-produced resources, and an activity that my students really enjoy a lot was we engage in some kind of Socratic dialogue with ethical dilemmas. So I gave them questions and scenarios involving AI use, and they were invited to think through these ethical dilemmas for themselves, and then they have to justify the reasoning and consider the consequences of different choices. So the assessment itself was very, very simple. So I chose the second assessment task, which is actually the first legal problem solving task in Law 110. And my students are correct. We are obsessed with legal problem solving. So it only weighs 10%. And I really like this because it's designed to provide like early formative feedback that they are going to carry forward into other assessments which are more heavily weighted, like the third assessment item, which is worth 30%, and the final exam, which is worth 50%. So and also it has a fictional component, which was a made-up piece of legislation, so it was going to be authentic. The AI was not going to readily give them what they wanted, and it was based on a statutory interpretation, so I have a really cool scenario. Now, so those steps, so the background of my story, the design, the creation of the assignment, those are steps 1 and 2 of the model. Now, for step 3 of the model, which relates to the evaluation of AI outputs, I ask my students to do 3 things. Criticize, or no, I just say, critically evaluate the response generated by AI. And I wanted to make sure that they engage in a proper decision-making process too. So how did they do that? Well, they needed to identify what aspects of the AI response were accepted, which one needed to be modified, and which one needed to be rejected. So they needed to give me examples of where AI suggestions or outputs were incorporated into their own answers, and why and when they deliberately disregarded those outputs. They also needed to reflect on situations where their own legal knowledge or the materials that I have provided throughout the course were stronger or more accurate rather than answers based on AI responses. And they also have to provide a structured reflection. So they needed to determine whether AI was helpful or hindering, actually, in the context of the task. Now, in terms of step 4, I'm just gonna, so they were required to compare the AI response with our methodology, which is the ILAC method of legal problem solving. So they needed to contrast, to juxtapose those decisions. And So for instance, when an AI response was clear or was well structured, students still were compelled to determine whether it was legally accurate, whether it was aligned with the statutory interpretation principles, and whether the jurisdiction was correct. So in making all these decisions, students look at the strengths of AI, they work on clarity, on legal issue identification, and also they were confronted with the gaps and the inaccuracies of responses produced by AI. So they have to recognize when legal principles have been misapplied, when key provisions were missing, information lacking. So basically students became decision makers. So they became like active evaluators, and then I asked them to justify their choices. Now, in terms of step 5, how did we incorporate step 5 of the CARE model here, which is based on reflection and learning? Well, reflection is a core component of the task because they had to articulate their experience with AI. So the task in that sense promotes reflective learning. And I want to talk about the role of feedback here. For me, it was all about feedback because, so for this task, students receive written feedback which was targeted at individual performance. They have the rubric of CORE, which is paramount and clarify the standards. But I also have discussion sessions, which I call collective feedback, allowing students to hear how others or their peers approach the same task. So they were learning from others' mistakes and experiences. So it was learning through narratives, which was very valuable, and everyone contributed, and it was very engaging. And most importantly, they were encouraged to apply what they learned to future assessments, including assessment 3 and the final examination. So reflection and the feedback were not treated like the end point of the learning process. They were like a bridge to a more advanced legal reasoning or more critical engagement with the subject and with the AI tools. And the last component, which is enhanced authenticity, well, I think the assessment was quite authentic because rather than producing an answer, they demonstrated how they arrived at it, and they tested, their accuracy, their validity. And all this was traceable. The whole decision-making process could be recorded. So I guess that the design supports a pedagogical, sound, responsible, or ethical integration of AI into legal education. So that's what we did in Law 101.
Thank you, Anna. And because we are running out of time, I'll just won't have all the time to present the last subject. But if you bear with me for just a few more minutes, I'd really like to tell you a bit more what I've done in MGT 510. So I thought that students using AI was an opportunity for me to finally do things differently in this subject that I was thinking actually about for a few years back. So seeing it as an opportunity, I thought the focus is not on AI, but how AI can support students' learning. And that was my focus in designing my assessments. So I've made a brave decision to allow students to use AI in all of the assessments, which is a little bit different. But this was based on my actually little trip into the literature and finding this wonderful concept of strategic thinking skills. It is such a nice upgrade, and it's an essential part of the already existing assessments in the subject. It's already part of everything that we do, except we never got to tell students about these skills. And I thought finally AI could be a student's best friend in exploring and developing these skills. So I said, students, yes, you can use AI, but not to do the work for you. Instead, you can use AI as your learning partner, and I've designed assessments to focus on developing those strategic thinking skills. So the literature says that we have three such strategic thinking skills. So synthesis, creativity, and vision. In assessment one, students used several frameworks and models to do their analysis, to do their research. And I suggested, why don't you now put your work into AI and ask it strategic questions? What does it all mean? How does it all come together? That's synthesis. To find new insights that could be useful in consequent assessments, in coming up with new original way of addressing organizations' strategic issues. So I've done the same thing as you can see on this slide in assessment 2, which was a nice video presentation where students needed to take on a role of an executive in the organization. And that was an input into assessment 3, which is a group assessment, where the group needed to come together and design a new strategy for the organization. Based on the inputs of each group member, where each group member presented slightly different views based on the executive role they took. Some took role of an HR person, operations management, IT. So that reflected their previous experiences, and it was a fantastic contribution to the group. So I won't go, because we don't have time, just too much into it, but the last step that I've done is ask them to discuss their learning of those strategic thinking skills after addressing the main tasks. So in short, this is my take on a slightly different approach to allowing students to use AI for a specific purpose in the subject to really address, enhance their learning. And I'll stop here because otherwise we won't have enough time for Q&A. So let me now ask you, what are your thoughts on everything that we presented? Any specific things that you would like us to talk a bit more about?
Can I go first? I'm really interested in the survey that Pia was talking about initially, and I guess the responses coming back from the students in terms of how comfortable they are identifying, disclosing, etc., how they've kind of gone about things, what those results sort of indicated. So, are you able to kind of talk to that a little bit?
I'm probably not ready because they just submitted a couple of weeks ago and we in the process of marking it. I suppose the survey is just as a prompt to get students to really sit down and think, do I want to use it? And if I were to use it, how do I use it? So as a way to encourage them to actually reflect how they want to use AI rather than as a way to really find out, what they did and so on. But I still ask them to submit a short video in terms of interaction, not really explaining the whole process that we talked about in the chat, but rather just to see what prompts do they use, and basically mainly to checking and to see whether they actually. But the first one that we just did is actually a board presentation, so I suppose they would use it a lot to probably help them to come up with the points of discussion, designing their slides, that sort of thing. And I just had a quick look. It seems that about 20% of students chose to use AI from the look of it.
Yeah, I'd be fascinated to see, I guess, the type of information they provide after the fact, but also potentially feed forward for
Mm.
future kind of iterations in terms of turning that type of activity into something that they think about before they actually submit the final artifact itself. You know, if it's actually, um, I guess, having them think a little bit more proactively about how they use it if they're going to use it. So maybe from both sides of the task, just my two
Mm.
cents anyway.
Mm. Mm. And I'm also conscious that, we try to incorporate things that students do that they spend time on in the rubrics. But I have to say, in the rubrics, I have no mention of assessing anything of their skills in relation to AI. Compared to last year, where when I mandate the use of AI was simply because mandatory versus optional use. And I've thought about this very hard, before I decided to allow students to decide whether they want to use it. And it shows that majority of them choose not to use. Some did, but it's only 20%. And obviously we rely on, the honesty or the truthfulness that they submit in their survey. And also on the phase that, if I do include that as part of the rubrics, what about those students who choose not to use it? So they won't be able to be assessed in that manner. So, and that is why the use of AI was totally ignored, I have to say, in the rubric. But there is a clause or in the assessment which make it really clear that they actually submit the work that belongs to them. So, and use of AI is part of that process. I'm not sure that answers some of the questions, but
Yeah, thanks, Pien. I appreciate it. I'll leave it open for others to get in here while we've still got some time.
thanks, Ingrid. I think the fact that we now encourage the use of AI, but we recognize the fact that there are still many really resist to use it. In my, private conversations with some of my students, for those who really tried using it, in accounting, especially producing financial statements, they don't really do a good job, to be honest. As in, like, the AI don't really do a good job. And that is where I see opportunity, where I can get students to, use it, encourage them to use it. Then they know what AI can or cannot use or cannot do.
I guess that's a teachable moment in itself, as you've pointed out, realizing the apparent failures. I think Anna was talking about that too, with the like fictional scenarios and things. There's an opportunity there to identify the flaws and weaknesses of standing alone on these tools rather than engaging with them critically and reflecting on that. So it kind of, I like that kind of trap idea. Maybe not call it a trap, but still, I like the trap. All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions from the floor for today, you can still add them to the chat after the fact, or reach out to the presenters. Oh, Ingrid's put one in there. Did any of the students use AI in surprising or very unexpected ways?
I did, because one of my questions in the survey was, how did you verify the output of AI? And one of the students I just looked at earlier, it says, well, I use ChatGPT to verify whether the outputs it's correct. So I almost burst in laughter. So a very unexpected way. Yeah, unfortunately, the survey is anonymous. So yeah, so that to me is un unexpected. I would expect them to say they would check against the accounting standards, the authoritative references, and that sort of thing.
All right, look, I'm going to stop the recording there, but I would like to wrap things up just by saying thank you very much to Arnella, Pierre and Anna today for sharing with us the Care Plus framework as it continues to be implemented with more results to come from what I'm seeing. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to the presenters, and we look forward to seeing you at another Teaching Academy workshop. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.